Hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge Lift podcast. Today, Ash and myself are discussing strength training and performance and how they work well together, and some considerations you may need to have when you're thinking about your chosen sports, and some things that you might want to then implement to ensure you can keep increasing your performance. So, Ash, I guess first things first will probably be, what is strength? We've kind of touched on this before, and I think it'd be quite good to just define it a little bit. But what's maybe the difference when it comes to strength and performance, or strength in performance?
So strength is usually defined as the capacity to produce force. So it's basically just how much force can you produce irrespective of speed, which would distinguish it from power. So this is the classic differentiator between, say, a power lifter and an Olympic weightlifter. Like a power lifter, there's not the same requirement to move the weight quickly. There's not as much speed and momentum as there would be in the more explosive weightlifting movements. And you could argue that in some sports, power is more important. If you're running, jumping, turning, the application of how quickly you can apply that strength has more use. But for the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to focus on strength as just the pure capacity to produce force, unless we decide to take a bit of a tangent and go a bit off-piste.
The good kind of strength. So when it comes to power, I find that quite interesting, how when it comes to most sports, that power is kind of what we need, especially like most because of the dynamic nature. But it feels that a lot of us focus, including myself at times, focus on building this top end strength, where in reality, that top end strength isn't the thing that's going to necessarily unlock our next level of strength if we play a sport, as an example. Would you say that's right?
Yeah. So I think, one of the things we need to cover today is what the purpose of your strength, like in what situations do you want to be strong? It could be purely unlocking numbers on a barbell, in that you want to hit a certain, like you want to hit a 200 kilo deadlift or something like that. You've got a milestone that you're working towards as a pure strength test. But if it's a more sport specific type of strength, like you want to be stronger on the ball in football, or you want to hit the ball further in golf, or you want to produce more watts when you're cycling, they're much more context dependent types of strength, and having an awareness of the motor patterns involved and the skill of being strong in that situation is very important. And just generic strength isn't the way to most directly pursue it. Like if you think of Messi, he's small, but he's very strong on the ball, especially for his size. He's probably not looking to pull a 200 kilo deadlift, but his strength in football is very high, or surprisingly high. And I think when you understand how he needs to apply that strength, like it's in 3 dimensions, like a lot of shoulder to shoulder contact, a lot of core strength, stable through the foot and the hip to resist being shoved off the ball. All these factors have a quality to the type of strength rather than just pure out and out kilos on a bar.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to that differentiation of understanding what your definition of strength needs to be, I think that's obviously the first step in everyone's journey, is in finding out what their performance strength should be. Now, when it comes to this, if it is the thing of adding weights onto a bar, that's going to be a pretty nice. We've discussed this in one of our previous episodes, obviously with the programming for performance and the considerations you may need to have. But when we're now looking into areas like this, we need to start taking into consideration a lot more like the neuromuscular adaptations that need to be had, and maybe other strategies and stuff to kind of push towards increasing our performance strength. So let's maybe touch on that. So when we start to go into our CNS.
Sure. Yeah. So I think we touched on it briefly in the programming podcast as well, and maybe one of the ones before, but muscles are composed of motor units, which are basically groups of muscle fibers. So there's 2 ways you can get stronger. If you make it really simple, you can have more muscle fibers and more motor units, or you can recruit more of the ones that you already have. So we call that neuromuscular efficiency. Like, what percentage of a muscle are you able to contract on demand or to use on demand? And most people operate in a relatively low percentage most of the time, unless they've become highly skilled at a movement. And we won't go into like the electro stim and like that debate there as to whether that's the best way to measure the efficiency of a muscle. But essentially, this is what explains somebody who's very wobbly in a movement versus somebody who's really smooth, is that they have very good coordination of recruiting the right number of motor units to achieve the task that they're trying to achieve. So on the bench press, somebody who's new, they'll be all over the place. It'll be quite jerky up, like going through the range of motion. They'll sort of accelerate and decelerate at sticky patches. Whereas somebody who's very proficient, it'll be relatively smooth through the whole range, because it's like a driver who's got good clutch control and good touch on the accelerator. They know exactly how much they need to get the acceleration they require. Whereas a new driver, they've got kangaroo petrol. They're sort of just jerking forwards and back because they're unsure of exactly how much they need to step on the gas to get the speed that they want. And through practice, that neuromuscular efficiency gets better. So it's lots of reps, lots of training, and your brain learns to control those motor units more efficiently. And that's a huge part of strength, is how well are you able to recruit most of your motor units. And then there's the physiological component, which is how many muscle fibers do you actually have? Because you can have all the muscle fibers in the world, you can be massive, but if you're very poorly coordinated, you're only using a small percentage of those. So somebody who has a smaller muscle but is recruiting higher could be stronger than you. And I think the coolest example of this for me is you look at some of the arm wrestling champions, and they're not the biggest guys, and they'll be taking on these absolute monsters of humans who are way bigger than them, but less skilled at arm wrestling and less efficient and unable to contract as high a percentage of their motor units. And you see these like relatively small guys crush the bigger ones. And that's all down to neuromuscular efficiency.
Yeah, I guess, and it also comes down to that thing, as you mentioned there, of like body awareness. So like where you are in space and time, because it's like something I say to a lot of my clients is this is where the scaling exercises come in as well. So it's you're obviously building towards a end, say, movement in particular. So you're going to scale it down so that you have control of your range, so that you can understand from ground up that, cool, okay, this is what needs to happen. So an example I use with my clients is, if you imagine your brain has to send a signal out before you do any rep. So it has to send a signal down your body. So it's got to go all the way down to your feet and then back up, and then it can say, right, initiate the rep. So what I say is, right, so if your brain signal's gone down to your, say, your stomach, and you're not tight, you haven't braced your core or anything like that, it's going to be a bit spaghetti-like. So like, cool, your brain's thinking, okay, I need to focus on that. And so we use a push-up here as an example. I'm going to use that, all right? So we've gone down, stomach's a bit loose, right, brain needs to say, right, I need to tighten that. Cool, okay, my bum's a bit loose as well. Cool, okay, everything. Okay, so let's now focus on my bum, my abs, and my chest, and my triceps, right? So that's how I'm going to do my push-ups. So your brain's not having to think about 4 things at once. Whereas if you then start to learn to brace and think about squeezing your glutes, that same signal will go down from your brain to your feet and say, oh, cool, my abs are fine, that's sweet. My glutes are switched on. So all it can focus on is put all your energy into your chest and triceps. So you'll be able to do a lot more push-ups because your brain has to do less. So it has to think out, cool, what are the light switches I need to turn on? They're all the ones in my chest and tricep, because everything else is doing its job. So that's when it comes to performance, is if you're loose through that midline and loose through the glutes and stuff, you're going to notice that you have to do more work. And that means your actual push-up will deteriorate. So that's just something that I use with my clients as a bit of a visualization tool, if you think about it like that. Nice. So, so when it comes to maybe like, when you're pushing yourself and you go to, say, failure in certain exercises or anything like that, is that a good thing? Because obviously we've mentioned before about training to failure and how it's great, especially for like, building muscle and, taking yourself to extremes. So can that kind of be pulled over into the performance world?
Not so much. So like we just spoke about, practice is the key for any performance and skill output. And the trade-off changes compared to hypertrophy in that to maximize the amount of practice we can do in a given time period, we don't want to wreck the body and have a huge recovery demand. Like if we could practice with no recovery requirement, you could just practice the whole time. Like all your waking hours, you could be practicing. So when we train to failure, there is a cost in that we have to take a bit of time off training to let the body heal and recover and be ready to go again. And I think it's the guy who trains GSP. I heard him speaking about this nicely once, where he's like, if you can do 10 pull-ups and be written off, like if that's your absolute max, you do 10, and then you need to take a few days off training, do it again 3 days later, you can do another 10. You can maybe do it twice or 3 times a week, and maybe say you can do it twice a week. You've got 20 pull-ups done in a week, but if you just do 5, you can do it every day, and you've then done 35 pull-ups in a week. So you've done 75% more pull-ups in a week over the course of a year. That's huge amounts more practice that you're getting over the guy who did 20 in a week. He might be bigger because he's gone to failure, so there's more of a hypertrophic response. But in terms of getting good at the skill and probably eventually your performance output, the guy who practices 5 every day is going to come out on top because his total practice is higher. So again, it's always dependent on the specific context for the athlete. But in general, if you're training to absolute failure, which writes you off and leaves you unable to practice for a short period of time, you're probably missing out on benefits of more frequency and more total practice when it comes to the skill of strength.
Yeah, I think it's like when you did your single arm pull up, I kind of like always bring this back because I thought it's a really good example where you was practicing that pretty much every other day and doing variations, doing this and that. You go on holiday, obviously putting a couple of kilos, but it's like you go on holiday, come back, but because you haven't been, that frequency's gone.
Yeah.
So then you try to do it again. It's like now you can't, or you're now obviously then not back to square one because you've obviously then been there, but you're now working back towards a more consistent single arm chin up. So again, it's that that understanding of what performance is to you and what things that you're going to have to say sacrifice and what things you're going to have to prioritize to ensure that you can perform at whatever your chosen task is.
Yeah, I think that's another great point that came out of the single arm pull up training. Was I used to do it once a week and probably do more in that one session than I would do in the 2 or 3 a week, and train to failure and come out knackered and exhausted. But because it was only once a week, the skill component didn't develop as quickly as when I did less per session but did it more times per week. And that's one of the reasons why I did change the program, because I was getting fed up of the slower progress. I was like, right, I actually need to train easier but more often, and actually that's what led to the strength gain, rather than if I was doing it for body composition reasons, then that'd be fine to have like one big pull session a week and bury myself, train to failure. But that wasn't the fastest way for me to make the strength gain.
No, and so I guess kind of coming tangent. When it comes to choosing exercises that help you perform better, I think exercise selection is key. So because one, you obviously need to find exercises that are as close to, say, using a single arm pull up, so which I know I've seen plenty of your variations, so exercises as close to the single arm pull up as possible to help you get that. And then, but I guess you don't want to be too far away from it by, say, doing, say, I don't know, well, I don't know, say a lat pull down, for instance. Even though that is a pulling exercise, you can do a single arm and it has some carryover and so forth. But that's quite far because you're locked in a lot of the time. It's quite the opposite end of the spectrum. So exercise selection is key. So the best thing to obviously get the single arm pull up is to do single arm pull up. I think that's obviously why negative pull-ups in general, so you're trying to get better pull-ups, I think that's why negative pull-ups are so good. One, for the eccentric loading through the muscles, but also because it's that patterning of the exact movement, but then just on the opposite way down. So maybe going into using golf, because I know we brought this up before, and like strength training. So obviously golf being, whether you class it a performance sport or not, is because in some eyes,
definitely is.
No, I know there is a performance element to golf. So what would be There's things out there which I know you've mentioned before, like Golf Ward or something like that, where basically they've taken CrossFit and like said, right, this is now going to help you build strength. So could we just touch on that again? Because I remember you said there was a golfer who got really strong and stuff.
So there's a lot of buzz in the golf community at the moment because there's a player called Bryson DeChambeau who just won a major, and he essentially spent a lot of time on his strength, packed on about 20 pounds. Not all muscle, to be fair, but is hitting the ball further than he was a couple of years ago, and saying that just hitting the ball further is a massive advantage because even if he's in the rough, he's just that much closer to the hole that it becomes easier to score well.
Gilmore.
Yeah, basically. And because of that, a lot of people in golf are now thinking, oh, maybe I should do some strength training because if I hit the ball further, the game becomes easier. I think that's another debate as to whether that is the most efficient way for most people to score better in golf. But the point is people are trying to hit the ball further in golf. So they're looking into strength and conditioning a lot more seriously than previously. In the sport of golf, people would avoid weight training because they think it makes you stiff and would negatively impact your swing and accuracy. He's proven that you can hit the ball further and still score well. So off the back of that, a lot of people are trying to cash in by selling strength for golf products. One of them is just CrossFit. So they're just doing normal CrossFit movements. Very little to none of those movements are golf specific or have that much what I would class as functional carryover to a golf swing. And it's in line with the point I was making earlier about the specific context that you want to be strong in. Doing a heavy squat has some like tenuous carryover to a golf swing in that there's hip and knee flexion and extension. And for some people, if they have a poor base of strength to start with or have done no strength training, they might feel stronger when they're hitting the ball. But my argument is that they could achieve the strength in golf training effect much more efficiently by, rather than using standard gym exercises, using exercises designed around golf. Like the simplest thing to do, if you swing a heavy club or you swing faster using a lighter object, you're keeping the same motor pattern but developing the skill and the club head speed that will actually allow you to hit the ball further. And it's just a massively oversimplified point of view in the standard strength and conditioning world that just lift weights and everything will get better. And it's not that simple. But it's a highly skilled, very technical movement, the golf swing, and doing bench presses, that you're using the same body parts, but in a very different way. So you might have some very tangential strength gains, but selling that as a golf product, I think it's a bit disingenuous.
I think is definitely this where obviously like functional movement patterns of pretty much trying to utilize many muscles at the same time is going to be like when we talk about being too far from the actual movement is going to have that closer carryover. So something like the squat where you are going for a total body movement per se, you're having to brace, you're having to understand, like I said earlier, understand where your body is in space and time. So that it may help, as you said, some kind of like generate some power because they understand, cool, okay, this is what my hips feel like, this is how the stretch feels like. And it's like using me as an example then as a unseasoned golfer and someone that's just been to the golfing range just a couple of your driving range, a couple of golfers. Yeah, exactly. Yes, I'm a golfing ranger. So go to the driving range and I go for an absolute wallop of a hit. Sometimes I get it right with the driver and stuff like that. Sometimes I get a real sweet hit. But a lot of the time, I have pretty good body awareness. But a lot of the time, I'm just over-egging it. I'm trying to go way too far back where you can, because what I've understood from golf is if you imagine like a towel, so like torque in a way, like that's screwing it up, but then going beyond. So then you've actually then lost that tension you've just built up, which is me going way too far back like a wood chop, and then you're actually losing that power. So it's just, I found that really interesting because I made sure I was filming myself because I was watching where I was just leaking energy and stuff. And it just, for being a relatively strong person,
absolutely,
and it just showed that then someone that isn't as strong, that I was golfing with, was a lot more consistent and just able to ping it so much better than me, just because he had that better body awareness of how to carry over. And that's then when understanding your strength training for your performance that you're trying to do is so important. And that kind of goes into cycling as well. And it's like, and we've touched on this before, and it's where, so I've gone balls deep into cycling at the moment, and I really want to get better. And what I'm noticing is I'm unlocking a lot of, say, performance gains because of my mental game. So I'm actually able to sustain the pain for longer. So I'm able to dig into it rather than pull away, because something I realized the other day was workouts, I know where the end is. So normally workouts are like 10, 20, most 30 minutes or whatever like that, right? But you're doing a workout, you know the end is. But with a cycle, you do a climb that's going to absolutely kill you, and then you got to continue after that. And it's like, and that's the hard mental thing. And that's where I'm starting to learn to gradually come in, kind of like, I've had the mental side. So now when it comes to the performance exercises that are kind of help with my cycling, I guess obviously cycling is going to be the main thing that's going to be help with my improvements. But how far away can I go to be able to help with my improvements with my cycling, would you say?
Yeah, great question. So I think that what it all boils down to is, are you strong in the movement? So if we look at golf again, the person who isn't as strong as you on a barbell but is strong, like Rory McIlroy, when he started, he weighed about 10 stone, but he could hit the ball further than you probably ever will, to be honest. And not to make it personal, but he is stronger in that movement, but he will never squat or deadlift what you've done. So the context is everything. To bring it back around to your question of how far away from the actual movement can you or should you go, this is back to that concept of the red pill functional continuum. It's the art of coaching to decide how far you need to go away. The simplest thing to do would be to crank up the resistance and do high resistance cycling, because that's exactly the same motor pattern, using the same muscle sequences, and you're in exactly the right shape in that you're on the bike and producing more force, albeit you'll probably have you'll struggle to keep the same cadence. Depending on what the athlete's limiter is, will dictate how far away from the core skill you need to go. And that could be to do with like movement, mechanics, like do they have some dysfunction? Do they have knee pain? Do we need to get them into a lunge to figure out what's going on at the ankle or the hip to correct where that energy leak is when they're on the bike? But if we can do it on the bike through like changing their cleats or changing like exactly where their bike setup is, those sorts of tweaks could mean you keep them on the bike rather than off the bike, which would always be the first priority. Like if you can keep them in the sport, there's no point doing a single leg balance drill if you can just have them spend more time on the bike, because a point that we make quite often as well is there's always an opportunity cost. So if I'm spending time doing a single leg balance ankle, that's time that the athlete isn't spending on the bike. So if your goal is to get better at cycling, then we want you on the bike as much as possible. There's no wrong answer. That you could probably make an argument for any movement having a slight carryover into any sport specific skill for strength within reason. But as a good coach, I want to go miles away from the movement that matters.
Yeah. I guess that kind of touches into the thing of, are you looking for just straight performance gains, or are you now looking for more of a GPP where beyond where you're cycling, so your day to day, that you're now stronger, but that some of the movements are, say, specific to a degree to, say, cycling, so that you might have some unilateral patterning, you might have some just bilateral stuff, or some core work. So all these exercises will help carry over to some respect on the bike. But as we said, like the bike is the end goal. That's where we want to be, and that's where we want their performance. But if we're in day-to-day life, and because of the bike will give you some not not so perfect positions of day to day. There's a lot of cyclists with massively rolled in shoulders. Their lower backs are kind of normally messed up. So it's like you might be thinking more of like a rehabby kind of exercises that are going to help once you're off the saddle. But then you obviously need to weigh up that decision of, is this now going to take away from performance? So it's as you said, it's the art of coaching, and that's where working specifically with someone, but also understanding where you want to take your performance and what levels you want to stop at. And I think that's key, because especially when it comes into, like, we want to just bring this back to, say, CrossFit, understanding when you got strengthening performance. So CrossFit as a whole has so many different performances. You need to understand what you want to get better in, because you're going to probably have to dial down certain areas, because to trying to become fitter, stronger, and say sticks is great, but that's going to be a very slow journey. And if you're willing to settle down for a slow journey, that's completely fine. But if you need to improve, say, your weightlifting, you might need to, say, ease back on, say, some top end strength, and you might need to ease back on the cardio and focus more on the gymnastics and, say, the speed of weightlifting as an example. So it's making sure you're understanding what your performance is lacking and then writing that down. And I remember when you programmed for me a while ago, it's like we just used the open as an example of having like the 5 opens, as in what was your limiting factors in these workouts? Was it time? Was it the specific movement? So again, that was then analyzing my performance and saying, this needs work, this needs to be improved. So that's where the being self-analytical is so good, and where it's so important when it comes to strength in performance.
Yeah, exactly. And the more closely you can identify what your limiter is, the easier it is to make the exercise prescription. So the movement, sets, the reps, time domain, all that sort of stuff becomes quite simple if you're clear on what is holding you back.
Beautiful. So I think that's finished there. If you do have any more questions about specific performance topics, do drop us a message, and we'll hopefully get them in our Q&A episode coming up soon. Apart from that, thanks a lot for your time. We really do appreciate you lending us your ears, and hopefully you've been able to take something away from today's episode. As always, you can find us on all the normal platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and find us on Instagram, Lunge Lift. But apart from that, thank you very much, and we'll catch you next week.
Cheers, guys.